trying to preach a sermon, but I just want to share with you a little bit about kind of the vision that God has placed on my heart for our ministry. And this goes back really to some verses that you've heard me probably talk about before. But as we look at a time of transition, so we lost our leader, our ministry leader. That threw us into transition. We transitioned out of church, and we're halfway transitioned back into church. I don't know what church will look like in 5 years from now. I don't know what this church will look like 5 years from now, or even sooner. And I don't know what the worldwide church will look like 5 years from now. I know that, or I think I know that after COVID, church will never look like it did in February of 2020 before all that happened. I just think there's been so much change that God is using that to call His church to something else, to different things. And I can share my opinions on that about what I think God might be doing, but I just have to wait and see like you guys are. But we are certainly in a time of transition. But as God's people, we are always in a time of transition. God is a God of new things. Robin and Amber were both on the pastoral search committee with me with Isaiah 43:19. Behold, I am doing a new thing. We were in transition then as a church. And we are, God is always doing a new thing. God is the God of a new song. He always wants us to sing a new song to Him. And God always wants His people striving forward in what He's doing next. He's never going to get us, and this is unfortunate sometimes when we want to sit back and rest, but God is never going to get us to a place where He says, okay, you're good there, just stay right there. I wish He would sometimes. But we are always in a time of transition. So I'm not a big mission statement guy. Most of the mission statements that I've seen are pretty cheesy. And the one that you're going to see tonight is a little bit cheesy too. But I do think that it's important for us as a team to kind of focus, and this is Praise Team ABL, this worship ministry, to focus in on in this transition time, what is the purpose, what is the goal, what is the underlying foundation for what we are doing and why we're doing it. And the verses that this comes from are 2 Corinthians 4, 5, and 6, and I've shared this with some of you already. For what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, with ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So if I had to boil those verses down in a cheesy mission statement, here's what I came up with. We proclaim Christ as Lord in humility, as lights powered by God, or as God-powered lights, because Christ saved us. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what that means in our worship ministry, because I don't think that this is some novel approach. I think it's really a foundational truth for who we are as worshipers, and really applies to a lot of different ministries, and not just our worship ministry. But the context of these verses in 2 Corinthians is just really interesting to me in how they match up with what a worship ministry is about. So we learn in Acts 18, Paul goes to Corinth. He starts a church. He lives there for about a year and a half. He's working as a tent maker. He's not taking any money from the church, which, believe it or not, they would later get mad at him for not taking money from them. I thought that was a slight of some sort, but he builds up this church for a year and a half, and then he moves on and goes to Ephesus. And he would get reports from people in the church, from letters and so forth, about what was going on in the church after he left. And after he left, the church was visited by a Christian leader named Apollos. They were even visited by the Apostle Peter, or Cephas. And there was no real competition or animosity at all between Peter and Paul and Apollos, but the fact that they had all come to the Corinthian church and and had led the church for a while, people started picking their favorite ones. And so they would kind of split up into factions based on who they followed. And so Paul heard a little bit about that disunity. He gets a letter from the Corinthians with all these questions, kind of practical questions about how you do Christianity, how you live the Christian life. And he also found out that there was some sin, some sexual immorality in the church that was not being dealt with. And so he writes what we know as 1 Corinthians to the church there to answer some of these questions, to try to deal with that sin, and to deal with this disunity that had grown up in the church. And so he writes that. A little time later, he gets another report from Corinth, and things are not good with Corinth, such that Paul says, I've got to go visit them pretty much immediately. And so he goes and he tries to take a trip there to address some of these things, and the trip goes very badly for him. He gets there, there's a lot of quarreling, dissension, disunity in the church, and in particular, there is a person or group of people there that pretty much attack Paul, and Paul leaves that church really in failure. I mean, he tried to do something. They rejected his kind of ministry, and especially one particular person who we don't know exactly what he did or who he was. But Paul says this person caused the grief and did the wrong. And so Paul goes back and sends a letter back to the church of Corinth, which is a letter that we don't have in Scripture, but it's a severe letter. It basically calls them out on this and tries to set them straight. And he thinks maybe that letter is going to end their relationship for good. But later on, he gets a report from Corinth that they received that letter, that they took action to correct some of those problems. And he's happy to hear that, but in the meantime, these false apostles had come into the church of Corinth and were all about kind of building up themselves and their ministry, and were very charismatic. And so Paul, in writing 2 Corinthians, has to deal with these kind of false teachers or false apostles. And so what were the characteristics of those? Well, the question became, whose ministry is real? Whose ministry is better? So these apostles, who Paul would sarcastically call super apostles, believed in signs and wonders. And they believed that your ministry had to be accompanied by miracles and things and powerful movements of the Spirit. They believed that Paul's ministry was not authentic because Paul was suffering, he was being beaten, he was being thrown in jail. So obviously, he couldn't be God's spokesperson, because we know that Paul was not impressive looking or impressive speaking, and Paul has said that himself. These people operated with letters of recommendation, so if they had a letter of recommendation from a big Christian leader, that added to their claims of authority. They were impressive speakers, they had imposing presence, and they believed that you had to have noble Jewish ancestry to be a real force for God. Now, in contrast to that, when Paul's writing 2 Corinthians, he calls them out on that, and he says, well, ministry has signs and wonders, but those signs and wonders come from God. They don't come from the preacher, the apostle. Paul says, my ministry is authentic because God chooses to reveal power by letting it rest on his servants in their weakness and suffering. So this is where Paul says, I asked God to remove this thorn in the flesh, and God said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. And Paul says, well, then I'll boast in my weaknesses, because that's when the power of Christ dwells on me. So I'll be content with weaknesses and insults and hardships and persecutions and calamities, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul was kind of taking what these super apostles were saying and flipping it around. Paul says the church at Corinth was his letter of recommendation, written on his heart. That the fact that they were there, the fact that they were Christians, showed his ministry was authentic. That Paul boasted not in strength but in weakness. And Paul says, my suffering doesn't invalidate my ministry, it legitimizes it. And he talked about all of the things that he had suffered on behalf of Christ. And I think we know Corinthians well enough and know Paul's ministry well enough that that's probably a review for a lot of us, but what we fail to see sometimes is what relevance that has for the church today as we look around and see kind of what's going on in the universal church with different charismatic preachers and so forth. But to me, it also has a real pointed thing to say about our worship ministry. Because in our worship ministry, we have a lot of these same tensions that Paul was dealing with between the super apostles and himself, in that we have this tension between we want to be good and be excellent, and that's important. But there's a tension between being excellent for our sake and being excellent so that we can communicate how wonderful God is. So the tension between performance and proclamation, the tension between excellence and authenticity, the tension between the quality of our show versus showing Jesus to the people. Excellence is important. I'm certainly not a fan of mediocrity. I would not accept mediocrity in any ministry that I was a part of, and yet I have to always constantly remind myself excellence is not the goal. Excellence is a tool for the real goal, and that is to proclaim Christ. And so that's what speaks to me out of this 2 Corinthians passage, because Paul is dealing with a lot of what the church today deals with we can put on an elevation type show with fog and lights and professional vocalists and professional musicians. And if we can do that and not overshadow the fact that we're proclaiming Christ, then great. But we can also be excellent with what we have and proclaim Christ in a clear fashion, and that's just as good. So excellence is a tool and not the goal that we're striving for. So if we go back then to this mission statement and the verses, Paul, in summing up his argument against these super apostles, says, "I'm not proclaiming myself, I'm proclaiming Christ as Lord, and I'm your servant for Jesus' sake. I'm here as your servant." And he says, the reason I do that is because God, who said in creation, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shone his light in my heart and removed the darkness from me. And so I reflect that light to you, remove the darkness from you, so that we're all light in God's eyes. And so we come to the statement, as a worship ministry, it's my hope that we proclaim Christ as Lord. That's the main thing that we're there to communicate. We do it in humility as servants. We're lights powered by God, and I would just briefly say that if we are trying to power ourselves through this and not allowing ourselves to be powered by God in the Spirit, then that leads to burnout. And I can share that whole testimony with you tonight. Some of you know my story is how I had to learn that lesson. And we do it because Christ has saved us. So just to break that down, and I could go into a lot more depth on each one of these. You can probably think about those things and do that yourself. But we proclaim Christ as Lord in humility. Christ, not me, is always the focus. And our humility has to be genuine. I read a book over the last couple of weeks that talked about, it's called I think it's called Dealing with the Praise and Rejection of Man. Or it may just be the Praise and Rejection of Man. It was an easy book to read. It was a great read. And one of the things it said is that as we take praise from people, and if we allow that to take seed in our heart, that we covet the praise of people for what we do for the Lord, that we're really setting ourselves up in competition for the Lord, because the Lord is the one that deserves all of that praise. We're lights powered by God. The light is shining into the darkness, and we're powered by God, not powering ourselves, and we serve because God saved us. We're servants, not stars, and gratitude for our salvation is the motivation that we have. So, just as we briefly went through that, based on that idea, and that again, I don't think that this is anything novel. I think this is how our worship ministry has been operating. What would you ask God to do in our ministry over the coming months as we look at what He has placed before us the God who can do more than we ask or think, according to the power of work within us, what would you ask God to do in our ministry and in our church, our wider church moving forward?